The story of Frankenstein starts off with a man named Captain Robert Walton. Through the letters he writes to his sister back in England, we learn that he is an explorer on a ship headed north to discover more and go further into the Arctic than anyone has gone before. His ship gets surrounded by ice, leaving him and his crew in a very dangerous situation, and on top of that, a very thick fog rolls in, rendering them blind and trapped. Once the fog clears a few hours later, he and his crew realize that to their dismay, they are surrounded by ice fields for as far as the eye can see. As they are looking out, they notice a dog sled racing across the ice, with what appeared to be a man of gigantic stature sitting in it. Confused and curious, they watch the figure until it disappears into the distance. A few hours later, the ice breaks apart, but seeing as it is now almost nighttime, they decide to stay put for fear of hitting an iceberg in the dark. In the morning, Walton wakes up to find his crew talking over the side of the ship to another man in a dog sled, stuck floating on a piece of broken ice. They persuade him to come aboard, and he then collapses from exposure and exhaustion. Walton looks after him for a couple of days, until the man is feeling better and able to speak again. Once he can speak, we find out that the man is Victor Frankenstein, and he begins to tell his story. Frankenstein grew up in Geneva, Switzerland. He lived with his mother, father, younger brother Ernest, youngest brother William, and their cousin Elizabeth. When he was 13, he found a book on the works of Cornelius Agrippa, a 15th century alchemist. This book is what sparks Frankenstein's interest in natural philosophy and alchemy, which he calls the genius that regulated my fate. After reading this book, Frankenstein becomes absorbed with the idea of the philosopher's stone and the elixir of life, but discovering the secret to life soon becomes his main ambition. At the age of 17, Frankenstein decides he is going to study his passion at the University of Ingolstadt in Germany, and both his parents encourage him. However, while they're deciding when he will depart, his cousin Elizabeth catches the scarlet fever and becomes severely ill, delaying him from leaving for school. His mother nurses him back to health, but then catches it herself and dies. This is just the first of the many losses Frankenstein experiences throughout the novel. After grieving for his mother, Frankenstein's interest in the secret to life becomes a full-blown obsession. A new departure date is set for him to leave to university, and after saying goodbye to his family and friends, Frankenstein leaves for Ingolstadt. He excels in his studies of chemistry and natural philosophy, and finally, after 4 years of dedication, schooling, and searching, he finds what he's looking for. On one dark and dreary night in November, Frankenstein worked in his room until the candle was almost burnt out. Surrounded by his chemicals and the corpse he stitched together from the different parts of cadavers, he finally brings life to his creature, only to be horrified when it opens its eyes. He tries to get some sleep, but wakes up to find the creature grinning at him, so he flees the apartment and spends the rest of the night wandering around the courtyard, terrified of the creature finding him. In the morning, he wanders the town trying to distract himself, when a carriage from Switzerland stops in front of him and his best friend Henry Clerval steps out. They return to Frankenstein's apartment, and after seeing that the creature's gone, Frankenstein invites him inside. But returning to the room where the event took place causes Frankenstein to go into a fit, to the confusion of Clerval. He falls ill with the knowledge of what he has done, and Clerval looks after him that winter, until finally in spring, he starts feeling better. One day, Clerval gives Frankenstein a letter from his family that had been sent to him while he was sick and unable to write to them. It's written by Elizabeth and expresses their worry for him. He writes back asking for the date he should return. Around the beginning of May, Frankenstein finally receives a reply from his family, though it is not the reply he was expecting. The letter he receives says that his youngest brother and the darling of the family, William, was murdered, the valuable locket he was wearing was stolen, and that blaming herself for the murder, since she allowed him to wear the locket that seemed to be the cause of the murderer's deed. Horrified and grief-stricken by these events, Frankenstein immediately got a carriage ready, said goodbye to Clerval, and left Ingolstadt to return to Geneva. One night, while he was almost home, there was a thunderstorm. As he was traveling through the rain, there was a flash of lightning that lit everything up, and in the distance he saw the creature. He thought to pursue him when another flash of lightning showed the creature scaling the side of the mountain, then reaching the summit and disappearing. Horrified with this realization that his creation is the cause of his brother's death, Frankenstein continues to the village and in the morning reaches the house. He speaks to his brother Ernest, who informs him, much to Frankenstein's confusion, that the murderer had been discovered. Ernest then goes on to explain that the accused is Justine Moritz, a servant of the family whom they are all very close with, because the locket that William had been wearing was found on her. They attend the trial later that day, and Justine explains her innocence at a house in a neighboring town. When she was returning, a man asked her upon finding out that child was him. She spent the next few hours searching until the gates to Geneva were closed. She then spent the rest of the night in a barn, woke up to the sound of footsteps, and returned to Geneva, where to her confusion the locket was found on her. After hearing her account of what happened, Elizabeth, believing Justine's innocence, speaks highly of her to the judge. After waiting for news, the family finds out to their horror that Justine confessed. They speak to her, and she because she would rather confess a punishment for murder communicated from the church. The next day, she is hung. Saddened by all these losses caused by his creation, Frankenstein left his home to travel alone in the mountains and distract his mind. One day, while he's looking out over the summits, he sees the figure of a man advancing toward him with great speed. As he approaches, Frankenstein realizes it is the creature, and is filled with rage and hatred. He yells at him and tries to fight him, but the creature avoids him, explaining that he just wants to talk, and that whether Frankenstein or not, whether he leaves him alone or ruins him. Curious, Frankenstein agrees to listen, and they go to a cave where they sit by a fire and explains his story. He had come to life very confused and frightened. He was overwhelmed by his senses and didn't know what to make of anything. Frankenstein had fled the apartment, and the creature didn't know what to do. He took some of Frankenstein's clothes and left the apartment to wander outside until he came to the forest on the edge of Ingolstadt. He entered the forest and, tired and hungry as he was, ate some berries and fell asleep by a stream. About a month passed of him wandering when one day he found a fire left by some travelers. Glad for the warmth it produced, he tried to touch it, only to be burned. He figured out that it was made of wood, put on it, and fell asleep. He stayed by the fire for a while and tried cooking food on it, finding out that the nuts and roots he ate tasted better like that. Eventually, with the coming of winter, food became harder to find, so finally deciding to leave the fire despite not knowing how to make a new one, the creature went out in search of another place to live. One morning, he found a little hut on the fields beyond the forest, and went over to it to investigate. Finding the door open, he went inside and found an old man preparing his breakfast. When the man saw the creature, he ran in fear across the fields and out of sight, but the creature was too fascinated by the hut to think about it. He ate the remainder of the man's breakfast and fell asleep. When he awoke, he continued traveling across the fields until he came to a small village where he was drawn to one of the houses by the food he saw inside. He entered the house, but frightened the children and women inside, and they started screaming at the sight of him. The rest of the villagers then came and attacked him, forcing him to flee. Finally, the creature found a little hovel, lay down, and went to sleep. In the morning, he saw an old man in the cottage, and decided to stay hidden, remembering how everyone else had treated him. Later, he saw a young woman walking with a bucket of milk, and saw a young man stop and talk to her, the both of them then disappearing into the cottage. The creature stayed hidden there for some time, and soon learned the daily routine of each of the cottagers, and realized that the old man was blind. He enjoyed watching the family and listening to the old man play guitar, but saw that they were very unhappy, and at times the young man would even sit and weep. For their sadness was their extreme poverty, and in the winter months their lack of food. He saw that the young man and woman would often go with him because they would give it to the older man. This made the creature feel guilty for taking food from their stores, so he decided to live off nuts, roots, and fruits he would find in the forest nearby. He also decided to do whatever he could to help the family, and would collect wood and leave it at their door. When the family discovered the wood, they were incredibly happy, and the young man was able to work on the house instead of go out. Glad that he could help them, the creature continued doing this. After almost a year of living with them, the creature had spent lots of time trying to understand them. He learned the meaning of a few basic words, and learned their names. They were called the de Lacy family, the young man was named Felix, and the young woman, who was his sister, named Agatha. The old man was their father. One day, a young Arabian woman named Saifi showed up at their door. When the family saw her, they became overjoyed, Felix especially, and she lived with them from then on. However, she did not speak their language. The family taught her how to speak French, along with her. The book used to teach her was Ruins of Empires, and so through the lessons, the creature not only learned how to speak, read, and write, but also humanity's history. He learned the importance of people place on wealth, class, and family, and through this knowledge hated himself for how worthless he was, and for his unnatural origins. His sadness and hatred of himself only deepened when he saw his reflection and discovered that he was horrifying. This discovery made him understand why everyone ran from him. One day, when Felix, Agatha, and Saifi were going for a long walk, the creature decided to go talk to the old man, who could not be prejudiced toward him since he was blind. It was going well when the others returned early. Agatha fainted, Safie ran from the cottage at the sight of him, and Felix attacked him and drove him away. Exhausted, the creature fell asleep in the forest. In the morning, he decided to go back and try and speak to them again, but found out that they had left the cottage in fear, and that he would never see them again. In a fit of rage and sadness, the creature then burned the cottage down. He had read off some notes of Frankenstein's that he had found in the pockets of the clothes he stole, that his creator was from Geneva. One of the many things the creature had learned from Felix was geography, so he set out in the general direction he knew Geneva was to try and locate Frankenstein. He traveled through the forest and eventually came to a river, where he stopped to decide which way to go next. While there, he heard the sound of voices and hid himself. He saw a little girl laughing and running from someone, and was watching her when she slipped and fell into the river. Scared for her life, the creature jumped into the river and rescued her, but when he pulled her out, her companion saw him and shot him, then fled. The creature knew after this that he was truly alone, and vowed revenge on Frankenstein for bringing him to life only to experience misery. He stayed in the forest for a few weeks, and when his wound was finally healed, he continued his journey, finally reaching the outskirts of Geneva. He saw a little boy in the woods, and decided he would kidnap him and force him to be his companion, but when he grabbed the boy, he found out that he was related to Frankenstein. Enraged, he strangled William and stole his locket. Later, he found a woman sleeping and planted the locket on her, running away when she started to wake up. This was none other than Justine Moritz, the woman accused and hung of the murder of William. The creature then told Frankenstein that he ran to the mountains, where he has been living ever since, and concludes the story by explaining his loneliness. He asks Frankenstein to make him a wife, so that he would have someone equally as horrible for him to be with, and swears that they would live the rest of their lives in South America, isolated from the rest of humanity. Slightly moved by the creature's story and eloquence, and fearful that the creature will continue to kill if he does not comply, Frankenstein agrees. He returns to Clerval, and they go on a trip, traveling through England to get more information on making the creature's wife. Yet even though Clerval accompanies, they don't really know the true reasons behind the trip. Frankenstein then leaves Clerval in England and goes to Scotland to create the second creature away from humanity. But just as he is about to bring it to life, he realizes how horrible a second creature would be for the world, and destroys it. Angered, the creature vows to get revenge, and tells Frankenstein he will be with him on his wedding night, before leaving him. Frankenstein then collects all of the bits and body parts, and goes out onto a boat to sink them in the sleep in the boat, and wakes up in the midst of a huge storm. He sees land amid waves and heads over to it. When he gets out of his boat, he is immediately arrested for murder. He finds out that the one murdered was his friend Clerval, and then becomes incredibly ill again from the sadness and horror. He is nursed back to health and released after being proven innocent, when he returns to his family and marries his cousin Elizabeth. That night, he waits up for the creature thinking that he was coming for him, but while waiting, hears Elizabeth's screams coming from the bedroom. Rushing in, he realizes to his horror that the creature had always meant to kill her, not him. He finds her dead and the creature gone. When Frankenstein's father hears of Elizabeth's death, he becomes ill and dies of grief. Frankenstein is now just like the creature he created, isolated from humanity and alone with no family. Vowing revenge, he chases the creature to the north, where the story comes full circle, and Captain Robert Walton finds him and helps him. Frankenstein's experiences, Walton gives up his own quest for knowledge, lead to his destruction. He goes to write another letter to his sister, explaining that he would be returning home, when he hears a strange noise coming from the cabin that Frankenstein's body is in. He enters to find the creature weeping over his creator's body. The creature exclaims that, polluted by crimes and torn by the bitterest remorse, death is the only way he will ever find rest now. He then jumps out of the ship onto the ice and disappears into the darkness to die.